Good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and today's episode is number 9 in the Malcolm X series. In episode 8, we concentrated on February 21st, 1965, the day Malcolm X was assassinated, and talked about just, some of the particulars with respect to the Audubon Ballroom and how the shooting went down, et cetera, et cetera. But the upshot of that episode that I hope you remember is the three uh, intelligence tactics that were clearly evident uh, just to the naked observer immediately um, when looking at the events on February 21st. The three tactics that we identified that being commonly used intelligence tactics were infiltration, security stripping, and diversion. And if you remember, the infiltration was the story of Gene Roberts. So we know there was at least one infiltrator who was representing Bossie. And anything that had Bossie involved in it was FBI. It was part of the FBI's COINTEL program. So if there's anybody representing Bossie involved in this assassination at all, COINTEL, that is a huge clue that COINTELPRO had at least a presence there, was involved in some manner, shape, form. The second tactic was security stripping. Uh, and I mentioned that there is a number of ways that you can security strip a security detail. And one is through removal, which we'll get into later. The other is through infiltration. Gene Roberts' presence there was a way to security strip Malcolm X's security detail. And then the third tactic was diversion. If you remember, in Gene Roberts' own testimony, he said that he was attracted to a something that went on in the back of the hall, an argument, an altercation between two men over an alleged pickpocket situation. It was all contrived. It was all planned. And then a smoke bomb, while everybody's attention was in the back, three men whom he had identified earlier as having been men that he didn't recognize sitting in the front row, but didn't check because he assumed since he got there late, somebody else had checked him. Three men walked up and at point blank range put 21 shots up in Malcolm X direction, hitting him 17 times. And of course, the man who shot and killed him was what we call shotgun man, using a sawed-off shotgun that he had snuck into the hall under his trench coat. We're going to find out the identity of that man, by the way. In fact, we're going to find out the identity of all five plotters eventually, not right away. What we're going to talk about today, episode 9, is the rush to judgment. This is another common tactic that you see in all of these assassinations. A manipulation of the legal system or a manipulation of the post-assassination investigation so as to hurry up and convict, both in the eyes of the legal system, but also in the eyes of the American people, the guilty parties, so as to make it easy for the guilty parties to get away. We see it every time. So we're going to talk about that today. This is one of the few times, didn't happen in JFK's case. It didn't happen in RFK's case. The guy that has taken the brunt of the RFK blame is still sitting in a jail out in California, when an autopsy clearly shows that he could not have been the one who killed RFK. And he's still languishing in a prison cell out there. Um, the MLK, the patsy has died. The JFK patsy died 2 days after the event. The patsies in these cases who take the blame, uh, in most cases, almost every case, that's how it ends for them. But in this case, we see some justice 55 years later. It's how long it took, but it did happen, and it has served to forcibly reopen the case, forcibly make people sit up, take notice, and ask the question, well, if they didn't do it, who did? So, but again, I find myself getting ahead of myself. All right, so let's get through the sources and get right to the meat of the material. I always, people ask me, why do you keep putting the sources up front like this? Well, I don't know who's joining me for the first time, and I don't want them to think I'm just pulling stuff out of my rear end here. So I want them to be at least casually aware of the sources that I'm drawing from. And so I always put them up front, and I usually talk about them briefly. The first couple episodes more at length, and less so as we go along. We're in episode 9 now, so I'm not talking about them at all. I'm tired of talking about them. But you can slow down the video or freeze the video if you want to and go through each slide and identify the sources if you choose to do that. All right, so yesterday we left off with the shooting itself, and I just left you hanging there. So here's the chaos that takes place in the aftermath. That's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. This is a picture of the man that the people caught. He's one of the shooters. His name is Talmadge Hayer. Actually, his name is Thomas Hagen. He changed his name later to Talmadge Hayer. I had talked about this in the first or second episode, how at some point in this series, I will start identifying people by two names because they'll have their given name, which sometimes law enforcement and the media uses, and then they'll have their Muslim name. Oh, a lot of these people are going to be Muslims, and they're going to have a second name. So, in order to uh, be clear who we're talking about, sometimes I'll use both names. In most cases, I'm going to use both names. So there's no doubt who I'm talking about. Some of these Muslim names are all very similar. There's a bunch of Alis, there's a bunch of Muhammads. So you really have to be specific who you're talking about. So anyway, after the shots, the three shooters in the front took off running. And one of Malcolm X's bodyguards fired and hit one of the shooters in the leg. This is him. And when he got hit in the leg, he fell down. And when he fell down, the crowd leaped on top of him and they were beating him senseless. They were trying to kill him. And he was literally rescued by the police, as you can see here. They wanted to kill him. The mob did. He was later identified as Thomas Hagen and then later identified as Talmadge Hayer after he converted to Islam. And he was a disciple of the Nation of Islam. So, yeah, they have one of the culprits. This is one of those rare cases. Well, I guess it's not rare. In the RFK assassination, Sirhan started the whole brouhaha by firing in RFK's direction in front of a bunch of people. In MLK's case, they didn't see who the shooter was. In JFK's case, they didn't see who the shooter was. You go back and historically and look at some of the assassinations of presidents in our nation's history. You know, Abraham Lincoln's assassin made himself known by jumping down to the theater stage and yelling out to the crowd something to the effect the South was avenged and hobbled off the stage. Uh, Mary Todd Lincoln was up in the balcony screaming. So it was pretty clear who did or who was involved at least. Um, in in William McKinley's case, it happened in broad daylight. And I'm trying to remember if he was the one on the train stand. I think actually he was the one where he was at the World's Fair and the assassin was in a handshake line. And as they proceeded through the handshake line, he had a bandage over his hand, and hidden in the bandage was a pistol. And when it was his turn to shake the president's hand, he shot him. In daylight, when everybody saw him, a bunch of eyewitnesses. In Garfield's case, it was at the train station. Was it Garfield? Trying to remember. It was the one over the issue of being guaranteed a job. And that happened at the train station. Shot him in the back, but it was right there in broad daylight. So, most of these assassinations, the assailant is a singular person and he is arrested or apprehended immediately. And I guess that's what made JFK really unique. There were no eyewitnesses. It was a long range shot. MLK is the same, but MLK wasn't a president, and neither is Malcolm X. But these are high profile assassinations. So, anyway, they've got one of them at least. And the thinking is, if you're in law enforcement, is you lean on this guy and he'll divulge the names of his accomplices because pretty much everybody knew there was more than one. Now, meanwhile, Malcolm X is lying on the stage up there. We talked yesterday about Gene Roberts administered CPR, and then Betty Shabazz, his wife, followed up. He was dying. He was bleeding out right there on the stage. And there was a medical center right across the street from the Audubon Ballroom. I've got the picture here. You can see in 1965 what it looked like. The medical center is the big circle. The Audubon to the left is the small circle. This should not be difficult. Call the 911 or whatever it was in those days. And the medical center, basically all you got to do is run across the street. According to Sheikh Omar, the medical attendants from the medical center across the street would not come over when they were called. They ran across the street to get the medics to come, and they wouldn't come. We had to send people over to get a stretcher. We had to put Malcolm on the stretcher. We brought him down. We wheeled him into the medical center. When we got him over there, they took one look at him and said that he's dead. They didn't even bother trying to resuscitate him. He was completely dead. Can you imagine a hospital refusing to come over from right across the street to help a man who's been shot as many times as Malcolm was shot? They didn't do it. We had to. And that's something that's always stuck in my mind. Um, wow. Yeah, just an unbelievable story. But this isn't the first we've heard of medical malpractice in an event such as this. We just got done talking about MLK. Remember that story? The attending doctor, the surgeon who treated, I use that term loosely, MLK was actually in with the Dixie Mafia. And according to a witness who was in the room, saw it happen, he put a pillow over his head. MLK was still alive and killed him in the emergency room after spitting on him first. So, and of course, we've talked at length about the medical malpractice that took place in Parkland Hospital. And I really would hesitate to call it malpractice. I think they were bullied by the Secret Service into silence in some cases, in some cases changing their story, whatever. But so this isn't the first time we've seen some hanky-panky on the medical side of this. Interestingly, the two men who had to run across to the medical center and retrieve the stretcher from the medical center because they wouldn't come get Malcolm X's body were later arrested by NYPD for the theft of hospital property. It's just an unbelievable story. But anyway, I thought I'd throw that in. This is a picture of Thomas Hagen / Hare. And now that they have one of the assailants who is a confirmed member of the Nation of Islam, there's no question immediately in the minds of the investigators, law enforcement, and the American people that at least we know the Nation of Islam was involved in the assassination. The question is, that doesn't mean that they were the ones behind it. So were they put up to do this? Were they the button men who were used by somebody above them? In other words, were they the patsy? Or were they the perp? That's the question, the $1 million question everybody has. And I've quoted Manning Parable before, and I've used his stuff. We're talking about the second conversion of Malcolm X. According to Professor Manning Parable, the NYPD, when he was researching these events, he found that in all of Malcolm X's public appearances prior to February 21st, the NYPD always had at least 20 men stationed or assigned to his speaking appearances, sometimes up to 24 men. And this was on every prior occasion. We've gone over exhaustively all of the death threats and the controversy swirling around Malcolm X. It's clear that they've got to protect him anytime he has a public appearance. And so prior to February 21st, they always did. But on February 21st, only two police officers were assigned to cover the event, and they were both ordered to remain in the Rose Ballroom, which is on the second floor. This is about as physically far removed from the Audubon Ballroom as you can be and still be inside the building. In other words, they were nowhere near the event in question. They were in the building, but they weren't anywhere near Malcolm X at that stage or that ballroom. And his conclusion, Manning Parable's conclusion, is that the police obviously had been informed by the FBI that the murder was going down to help facilitate it. That's his view. That's his opinion, but uh, that's kind of the road that we're taking as we proceed. And a lot of it's going to be stemmed from the fact that this rush to judgment that's going to take place when the arrest of the other two alleged assailants is eventually going to unravel. And when the unraveling is happening, we're going to find out that the reason it's unraveling is because the FBI uh, helped facilitate their arrest and their conviction so as to protect somebody else. And so that immediately casts suspicion on the FBI. That'll take some time to get to, but that's the direction we're heading. Anyway, that's his view. Um, Remember now, Malcolm X's bodyguard claimed that he hit two of the fleeing assassins, not just one. He hit the one in the leg, but he said he sprayed bullets and he knows he felt sure he hit the second one as well. Uh, we know that the one is, we know for sure his story is true about the one because they caught the guy and had to take him to the hospital and treat him for being shot in the leg. But the second shooter escaped. And so it's just the word of the bodyguard saying, I know I hit the second one. But there is some testimony from an eyewitness. His name is Herman Ferguson. Herman Ferguson was standing outside the Audubon Ballroom after the shooting, and when all this commotion came out through the doorways into the sidewalk area where he was standing, as people were fleeing the building from the shooting, but also chasing the assailants. And he said that this officer started walking back towards me, and he was assisting a man who was wearing an overcoat and who was wearing a fez. He brought him to the car, he opened the back door and put him in the back seat. The man was bent over in severe pain, like he had a stomach wound. I heard this officer say to the driver of the car, let's get out of here. I expected the police to make a turn and go across the street where the medical center was and take this guy to that hospital and get some help for him. Instead of doing that, the driver straightened the car up and drove straight down 166th Street, down the street, down the hill. I never saw that car again, and that has always puzzled me. So now you have corroboration of the bodyguard who is claiming he hit two of the assailants. We've caught the one, so we know that happened. The second escaped, and so there was some question whether or not he really did hit a second assailant. But according to Herman Ferguson, who doesn't know the bodyguard and is not in the event itself, he's just passing by on the sidewalk out front of the Audubon at just the right time. His story corroborates the bodyguard story. So we now know that, and what's uh, alarming about the story is not the fact that there was a second assailant. We all know there was at least three. It's not the fact that the guy was hit, corroborating the bodyguard story. It's the fact that he was helped to escape by the NYPD. If you believe Herman Ferguson, the police officer helped facilitate his escape. He was probably going to get caught, but the police officer helped him escape. So, immediately, if you care to investigate this thoroughly. Of course, the NYPD is not going to investigate the NYPD, but uh, researchers will. Immediately in the aftermath, you already have a clue that this is an inside job. We already have evidence of an NYPD slash bossy officer, which means COINTELPRO and FBI, has infiltrated Malcolm X's bodyguards. Okay. We already have evidence that uh, these intelligence tactics, infiltration, diversion, and security stripping have happened. And now we have evidence that there was a NYPD officer who helped a second man escape. And we have this, I don't know what we do with this anecdotal evidence, but it's going to contribute later to this overall package of evidence that this was decided in advance. This was planned. This was coordinated, where the medical center wouldn't even come across to treat Malcolm X, and later arrested. The NYPD later arrested the people who did try to facilitate treatment by going across to the street and getting the stretcher. So, and then we already know that the NYPD in all the prior Malcolm X events had between 20 and 24 officers stationed there at the event. This time they only had two, and they hid them in the other corner away from in the building, as far away from Malcolm X as they could. There's a lot of evidence already to show that this is an inside job. Um, as far as the crime scene itself, boy, this reminds me so much of Dallas. Um, the shooting happened at 3:15, and it left the building, the inside of the hallway, in just a terrible mess. Obviously, you're spraying 21 bullets around in the direction of the stage. You've got bullets, you've got bullet holes, you've got blood, you've got chairs overturned. People panicked and fled. The chairs, the tables. Uh, it was a big mess in there. And furthermore, it's a daggum crime scene. It's a crime scene. Top picture left, you see circles. The backdrop of the stage, those are bullet holes. Um, you've got blood all over the stage from Malcolm X, but certainly there were people crowded around Malcolm X that, including Gene Roberts, who might have some of their evidence, their D, whatever evidence might be mixed in with Malcolm X's, that you definitely don't want to uh, corrupt the crime scene, right? And you probably have shell casings laying I mean, if 21 bullets were fired, you probably have shell casings lying all over. So ballistics is going to be, evidence is going to be plentiful. You're going to have physical evidence, ballistics evidence. You're going to have witness testimony. You're going to need to take pictures of the scene. This is a crime scene. But in events like this, what we've learned is that all crime scenes are not created equal. If you remember the JFK situation, the crime scene was the car, part of the crime scene. And if you remember, what did the Secret Service do with the car as quickly as possible? They cleaned it at Parkland Hospital. First of all, they drove it around back to get it away from prying eyes. Nurses were sticking pencils through the hole of the windshield in the front. They were looking into the car itself, and people were gathered around. You know, wouldn't be a stretch to think somebody might pull out a camera and start taking pictures. So immediately, the Secret Service drives it around backside of the hospital, and they get hoses out and buckets of soapy water, and they start cleaning it, the crime scene. Then they put it on a plane, sent it to Dearborn, Michigan, and had it rebuilt. Knock the windshield out, replace it, start rebuilding the car. It's the crime scene. This is before any investigation has taken place. Uh, what they do in Memphis at the crime scene, they come in the city the next day. According to the New York, the reporter who was there, they cut down all the bushes and they trimmed the trees around the flop house, the bushes that were across the street from the uh, Lorraine Motel. This is the crime scene. Now, here we are again, 7 o'clock. They're supposed to have a dance that night. Now, you would think that dance would get canceled. But no, they quick cleaned up the crime scene, put all the chairs back, tables, and they had the dance. It went on as scheduled with the bullet hole still in the walls. There's probably still a spot on the stage floor where Malcolm X's blood was. It's hard to get blood out of wood. They just went on with the next scheduled event, cleaned it up. So much for the crime scene. So this is another thing that you see happen oftentimes in these contrived crime scenes, where in a rush to, you know, have the narrative become the history, so to speak. You've already caught one of the guys, and so you figure he's going to spill the names of the other two, but you're in a hurry to cover up something. You're not, this is a violation of the most basic law enforcement uh, protocols. You always protect the crime scene, unless you have some reason that you don't want to protect the crime scene. You want to cover something up. And you see it over and over and over again, cases like this. So 7 o'clock comes and they're having a dance, literally in the same hall, in the same room where Malcolm X has just been assassinated earlier that day. Just unbelievable. All right, so here is the rush to judgment. Several weeks after the assassination, two more arrests were made. Norman Butler, pictured on the left, also known as Muhammad Aziz, and Thomas Johnson, pictured on the right, also known as Khalil Islam. Now, these were convenient scapegoats because they were petty hoodlums, known well to the NYPD. They both had criminal records, and they were both Muslims. And so arrests were made, and this was supposed to clear up the whole case. A lot of eyewitnesses, when asked, said they saw three shooters, which of course they did. There were three shooters. Uh, no one was putting two and two together yet, thinking that those other two were part of the plot in the bag, creating the diversions, right? So when asked who did the shooting, it was pretty consistent across the board. There were three shooters. Well, they caught the one, and then one escaped, according to Herman Ferguson, and even after he'd been shot with the help of a police officer, and then the other one just disappeared into the ether. So they're on the lookout for two men, and they catch these two guys. So who were these two guys? According to Professor Manning Parable Johnson, used to carry groceries to Betty Shabazz and Malcolm X's home, serving as a chauffeur for Malcolm X before there was a fallout between himself and Malcolm X. And both of them were outspoken opponents of Malcolm X. There'd been a fallout, and they were very outspoken in their, and by this time, there's a lot of people that don't like Malcolm X. So it's not like, and they're both confirmed that they're both part of the Nation of Islam. So it's not a stretch to believe that they're not friendly towards Malcolm X anymore, because Malcolm X is no longer part of the Nation of Islam. This isn't new news here. So they're both outspoken opponents of Malcolm X, but as such, they would have been instantly recognized and stopped at the door. Now, they were not searching people, but they were standing. They had bodyguards. Security detail was standing at the doors, watching for faces of people that they knew could be problems. And these two men would have been problems. In fact, according to Parable, quote, they never would have gotten into the Audubon. They would have been instantly recognized. Benjamin Kareem was former assistant minister to Malcolm X, said, quote, Norman and Butler were innocent. You couldn't have paid them to walk through those doors. We knew them. We knew what they were capable of. We were in charge of who came through that door, and we knew every Muslim at mosque number 7. And Norman and Johnson were as familiar as we were there with each other. They were innocent. They were railroaded into prison. Uh, uh, According to these witnesses who were part of the security detail at the door, they weren't even there. They wouldn't have been let in if they had tried to come, but they were not even there. And so this is why he's so sure, Benjamin Kareem is so sure they were railroaded into prison because uh, we didn't see them and we were controlling who came in, who didn't. We knew who they were. They knew who we were. We wouldn't let them in, but they never came. So we never had that situation. And even Hagen slash Talmadge Hayer, the one guy who was caught because he got shot in the leg, maintained that he wouldn't tell who his conspirators were, who his who collaborated with him, but he did say that both Butler slash Aziz and Johnson slash Islam were not involved. When he was asked, he said, no, they had nothing to do with it. They didn't have, the cops didn't have any physical evidence. The one guy who was guilty and caught in the act, so to speak, Hagen, both he's saying that they were not involved. Nevertheless, without any physical evidence and contradicting the testimony of the one culprit, they were both convicted. They both had verifiable alibis. Uh, that they weren't even there. They were somewhere else. But this is one of those rush to judgments where, uh, because of their criminal history, because the NYPD knew who they were, they black men, they were Muslims, and we need two guys, and here's two guys that fit the profile what we're looking for. So they arrested them, disregarding their alibis, disregarding the testimony of Hagen, and with having no physical evidence tying them to the scene. They got him convicted anyway. And they they never were made aware that throughout the entire trial of the two men and Hagen, nobody from NYPD or Abbasi made the district attorney aware that they had a witness who could identify who those three men were because he saw the three men and consciously made a decision not to question them, thinking that they had already passed through security, but he noted that there were three men he didn't recognize. And of course, he was close enough to perform CPR on Malcolm X, and he saw the shooters. And his name was Gene Roberts. Talked about a story yesterday. They didn't reveal this to the district attorney because they didn't want the district attorney or anybody to know that they had an infiltrator in Malcolm X bodyguards because they wanted to use him again later, which they did against the Black Panthers. So Gene Roberts, who could have confirmed whether or not these two men, Butler and Johnson, were guilty, was not his presence there was not made known to the district attorney. He was not ever made available to give testimony, either for or against the two men, so that they could protect their infiltrator, their provocateur, their informant. According to Herbert J. Stern, who was the former assistant district attorney in New York County, he said, we never knew. Here he is standing in the front of the crowd, could see everybody's faces, including the faces of the assassins, whom he later identified as being three men he didn't recognize, which means he noted them. He noted their appearance when people were still entering the facility. They were never made available to the district attorney. So they got convicted. And in 66, after the trial was over, both of these men were sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Hagen received a life sentence. 11 years later, It's about approximately about 1977. Hagen finally divulged the names of his true accomplices, and it wasn't two men, it was the names of four men, which brings the total to five. Now, here we are. That was in 1977. So he divulges the names of his accomplices. And as of 2025, as of this moment today, none of these four names, four men, have ever been charged with any crime, and there was never any investigation of the four men. It was like it never happened. Meanwhile, what happens to these two men? Well, according to Tony Bauza, who would know, we've already, this is, he's pictured down at the bottom here on the left, because remember, he's the New York NYPD detective who's working with Bossy, uh, surveilling Malcolm X. And of course, Bossy was working with the FBI, COINTELPRO. He said, quote, I thought the investigation was a failure. I thought it was mishandled from beginning to end. The NYPD had a few shooters and they were relieved, as we all were, relieved to death. If I'd been chief, it would have been different. That's not the way I worked. If you get the shooters, you better get the guy who sent them. So Bauza was pretty convinced that, first of all, the investigation was a sham. And he would know he's on the inside. It was just about getting somebody and for the public's consumption to satisfy the public, right? Remember now, we've talked about this, how important the psychology of making arrest, quick arrest is, because we have this need, this psychological need to have answers and to know who the culprits are and to be able to get some sort of vengeance or justice or whatever, revenge, whatever you want to call it. And then we move on. Life moves on. We move on. We want open and shut cases. We want, if there's a question, we want answers at ASAP. And so it works to the advantage of law enforcement to rush to judgment because we, the people, want quick answers. Samuel Bilal, an eyewitness, says, quote, the hidden hand behind Malcolm's assassination was the big boys down in Washington. This is him pictured top left. But that members of the Nation of Islam probably were the triggermen. This is the operating theory that I am pursuing in this study. I started off with an open mind, just, okay, let's just see. But then as I got into it, it's pretty clear, almost pretty apparent pretty quickly that Nation of Islam was being used. And they were the button men. They were the Cubans and the mob of the JFK. They were the Sirhan of RFK. They were uh, the what's his name from MLK? I'm forgetting his name. The patsies, and there's somebody behind them pushing these buttons. And the fact that Bauza is involved, which he readily admits he was part of Bossy. If you know anything about Bossy, you know they're with the FBI and COINTELPRO. So you've got Bauza involved, surveilling, knowing Malcolm X on a first name basis. He's there every time Malcolm X is in public. Bauza is there. They knew each other. So that's Bossy and COINTELPRO right there. And then the fact that Bauza inserted Gene Roberts as an infiltrator as part of Bossy. Uh, and immediately you know that there is a federal presence here. Of course, Malcolm knew it. When he got back from his last trip, when he got denied entrance into France, he said, boys, my problem's not in Chicago, my problem's in Washington. And so uh, Khalil Ali, or however he said, quote, it was predicted that they would blame the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad even said that. But Elijah Muhammad told everybody, my believers, do not lay a hand on our brother, Malcolm X, because he is not aware of what he is doing. Give him time. Do not raise a hand against Malcolm X. He said that in the temple. I was there. So Ali is saying that as far as the Nation of Islam is concerned, it's set up. it's just too easy. We have this motive that everybody's aware of because of this very public, messy divorce between the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, that it would be very easy to set us up as the boogeyman, take the blame in this situation when our leader ordered us to leave Malcolm X alone. Um, Akbar Muhammad, former assistant minister Malcolm X, corroborates what Ali said, quote, his words were, quote, leave Malcolm alone, to all of his ministers and to all of us. Leave Malcolm alone. So if you're Elijah Muhammad and you know uh, the level of animosity that is out there for Malcolm X, you realize that if one of yours assassinates Malcolm X, um, it it's going to be a real problem for your organization. And of course, even if one of yours doesn't do it, people are going to automatically assume that one of yours did do it because you guys have the motive. So he was very plain spoken about his orders going out to everybody in the Nation of Islam to leave Malcolm X alone. He wanted it on the record. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't do it. We've already established the fact that Talmadge Hayer, or Thomas Hagen, whichever name you want to go by, was Nation of Islam, and he was caught in the act. Okay. Now they have two Nation of Islam uh, brothers that have also been convicted and sentenced. So it appears on its face that three Nation of Islam took vengeance against one of their former brothers, Malcolm X, and assassinated him. This in disobedience to their leader who said to leave him alone. So the question is, were these just rogue Nation of Islam operators who just took justice into their own hands or vengeance to their own hands? Or were these people set up to do this so that the Nation of Islam could be the patsy? And that's the question we've got to answer. In 2020, we get a big clue. Now, this is why I said it took 55 years for justice to be served with respect to Butler and Aziz, or Butler and Johnson. I'm getting all the names confused myself. Um, they were arrested in 65. They were convicted in 66. They've been sitting in a prison ever since. In 2020, 55 years later, a Manhattan judge dismissed the convictions of both Butler and Johnson after prosecutors said new evidence of witness intimidation and suppression of exculpatory evidence had undermined the case. When we talk about some of the exculpatory evidence, A, they both had alibis that they were somewhere else. B, the main assailant said no, they weren't involved. C, there was no physical evidence. Okay, that should have been enough. That's why we have it's called reasonable doubt. If they weren't there, and according to, it wasn't just that they had alibis of being somewhere else. The security detail at the doors never saw them come through either. Nobody there saw them because they weren't there. So that should have been the end of the investigation as far as they were concerned. Anyway, none of that was presented to the jury, as we mentioned. The fact that Gene Roberts, in subsequent years, admitted that it wasn't those two, right? He was never called to testify because the DA was never alerted to the fact that he was there, that he was facing the crowd and could see who the assailants were. He saw their faces. It wasn't until afterwards that he also admitted, well, it wasn't them. Those weren't two of those three men that I saw. So, in light of all this evidence, 2020, they finally get their convictions dismissed. District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. actually apologized for law enforcement's, quote, serious, unacceptable violations of law and the public trust. And the New York City Law Department supported Vance's opinion that the men had been, quote, wrongfully convicted. So, I mean, I'm laughing. I shouldn't be. It's not funny. If you are Butler and Johnson from 65 on to 2020, the public perception of you is that you killed Malcolm X. You participated in the assassination of Malcolm X. Now, were you innocent as the driven snow in 1965? No, you weren't. You had criminal records, both of you. That doesn't mean that you killed Malcolm X, and you shouldn't have been in prison for that crime. It was a rush to judgment, and it was intentional. That evidence was intentionally withheld, suppressed. The fact that Gene Roberts was there and could identify them or not identify them was intentionally withheld. And those decisions were made uh, above the NYPD. They include the NYPD, but those decisions were made above. The decision to withhold Gene Roberts, for example, he was he worked for Bossie. Bossie was COINTELPRO FBI. They had plans for him going forward. We talked about the Black Panthers. It was FBI's decision to withhold Gene Roberts from the New York District Attorney. Now, NYPD did their part, and they withheld the alibis and other exculpatory evidence. But it was these law enforcement agencies working together all the way up to and including Washington. It was intentional. So the question is, if it was intentional to falsely accuse these two, why? Who are they protecting? Because if these men were innocent, that means the other two, and of course, we're going to find out in 77, there's actually four accomplices with Hagen. They're running around free. We got two of the wrong guys, and the four guys that we should be getting, the guilty ones, are out running around free. So the intentional withholding of evidence to convict these two was an attempt to protect those four. That's the only conclusion you can draw. In 2021, a year after their exoneration, the city of New York actually settled lawsuits filed on behalf of Butler and Johnson, and they agreed to pay them $26 million total for their wrongful convictions. And then the state of New York chipped in an additional $10 million. Okay, so this, it's one thing if after their death, the law enforcement or the legal system comes out and say, hey, we made a mistake, blah, blah, blah. It's another thing to pay them and their families these huge settlements. You know, that is like a nail in the coffin of the original conviction itself. And what this means is, the state's not in a hurry to cough up $36 million to anybody. But the mistake was so egregious. It wasn't a mistake. The intentional railroading of these two men was so egregious that they'd spent so many years of their life locked up. And so many people believed that they were guilty of something that they weren't guilty of, including their own families. I've seen interviews. Now, Johnson has died. He's no longer with us, but Butler, as far as I know, is still alive, and he's given some interviews, and he's pretty much lost his whole family. He had kids. They grew up without a father, and they grew up thinking their daddy killed Malcolm X. And even after the exoneration, the extended absence and you know, just the trauma of all that had taken place, this forced separation, so to speak, it created a rift that's been irreparable. He doesn't know his kids. He doesn't have a relationship with his kids. I saw one episode or some footage of him, and he's looking at a Facebook page that he's gotten on it. He's following his kids and grandkids via Facebook, and he's trying to put names with faces. He doesn't know them personally. I think this one is Rebecca. I think this one is, he doesn't even know his own kid. He knows his kids' names, but he doesn't know his grandkids' names. That's the price that was paid so that those four men could get away. Two innocent men were convicted, sent to prison, lost everything in the rush to protect those four. So what we're going to be doing from this point forward is we're going to be on the hunt for those four. We know who the one is. He's paid his debt to society. He he was caught right away, went to prison, and took him 11 years to name his accomplices. And law enforcement showed no interest in pursuing those four names. The legal system showed no interest in pursuing those four people. There was no investigation. Nothing has ever come of it. And nothing ever will, because some of them have died now. But researchers have pursued it. And it's just like the JFK case, where the powers that be washed their hands of it, said Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. They have been dragged kicking and screaming by the research community to re-examining what really happened in Dallas. It's the same thing in LA with respect to RFK. It's the same thing in Memphis with respect to MLK. And now it's going to be the same thing in New York with respect to Malcolm X. The good news is, if there's any silver lining to come out of this, is that we now know that the two men that were convicted as being part of this three-man hit team were innocent. And that gives legal, like a stamp of authority to pursue these other four, because we know their names. And we now know that Hagen was telling the truth when he said Butler and Johnson were not involved. And he's the one that gave us the four names. So there is some credibility there that he is a truth teller. We now know that those two were innocent and they were railroaded. So that begs the question, if it wasn't them, who was it? We might as well pursue these four names. And then when you start looking into these four names, pretty quickly you understand why they were protected. Pretty quickly you understand why no investigation pursued them and why those two had to be the sacrificial lambs. So I hope you're starting to see some similarities here. We've got patsies. We know we've got two patsies. And it's been certified by courts that they were patsies. We know there's been intelligence tactics at work, such as infiltration, such as security stripping, such as diversion. We learned of some more of that security stripping today, whereby not only is Gene Roberts an infiltrator, but 24 NYPD officers that were supposed to be there weren't there. Only two were there. That's some more security stripping, but there will be more than that. We already know about the diversion. Now we know about the cleansing of the crime scene. And we know about the rush to judgment, the setting up of patsies. Does any of this sound familiar? Okay, that's enough for episode 9. Tomorrow's Sunday, so I'll take a day off, and then Monday is Memorial Day. So I probably will not be able to do a video on Monday. So my next video will be Tuesday, and Monday the library will be closed. So I lose my access here. But so we'll be looking at episode 10, and it gets pretty interesting going forward from here. So look forward to resuming, and until then, everybody has a blessed weekend. Thank you.